Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, once again, professional horse trainer, and Deb Romero, certified Alexander technique instructor, my ubiquitous guest. I love I love doing this podcast with you.
It's the only time we get to see each other anymore.
I know. And I was talking to Stephanie about doing a podcast on horse nutrition. I'm really looking forward to that.
She's
But
very
she's
knowledgeable.
like, yeah. And I go, it's completely unscripted. I said, Deb and I started this because we missed each other in
Hmm.
starting in 2020. And I go, this is the stuff we talk about anyways. So
Right. When we're at
why
the end of
not?
the day.
Yeah, why not put it out there?
Yeah,
Food for thought for
there
people.
you go.
Yeah. Because I think, like, even our last podcast where we talked about self-awareness equals choice, one of the things I see in the horse industry is we don't look past a lot of tradition. Oh, we are so mired
Mhm.
in tradition when it comes to how we train riders and how we train horses. And we rarely look at other choices. We rarely look at other alternatives.
I think that's and we've said, I don't know if we said this on the podcast, but we said it to each other for such a long time that we feel like we're on an island of misfit toys.
Yes. Yeah, and people
And that we
who
just keep experimenting and learning, and maybe it's we're just lifelong learners. I don't know.
I think if you own a horse, you eventually quit fighting that idea and you just
Uh,
get used to the idea that you're never going to know it all. And somebody else out there has a great idea that you can learn from. And that was really the impetus behind this podcast was,
Good point.
planting seeds of choice for riders, for
Yes.
horse owners, for trainers, that you and I have spent our careers sort of going through the weeds
Oh, no
of
kidding.
tradition and looking for something that was more reliable, got better results, and just achieved what we wanted to achieve with the horses that we had.
Yeah, and I think the horses have been, at least my horses have been my best teachers.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they've pushed me to change, to make different choices.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, and I was working with a rider at a clinic not long ago and sort of changing, like we talked about last time, that bringing up this self-awareness and changing our habits in our neural pathway called riding takes this immense amount of mental focus, especially at
Mhm.
first. And this rider laughed at me and she goes, I wish I could record this lesson. She goes, what you're saying is everything I'm going through right now in AA. And I went, oh, I didn't see that coming. But I laughed and I go, your horse could be your sponsor.
There you
Like,
go.
just let your horse guide you because they have a way of really confronting some of our
Mm.
inner, like horses have a way of sort of scratching on whatever little weaknesses that we have. It's like they figure out where our personal weaknesses are and they sort of just scratch on them over and over and over.
Yep.
And that's usually when somebody will come and say, my horse has this problem. And I go,
Hmm.
well, your horse is kind of scratching on something between the two of you.
Yep.
So I don't even think I mentioned today's topic yet.
Nope.
So today's topic is about, we're going to take a little sidebar away from sort of this inner analysis and look at legs and leg contact for riders. And I think legs and how we use our legs, especially, it applies to when we're in a cart, but I think it's more important when we're riding and we're actually straddling a horse, that how we use our legs. Because all like when I went through England, I would go to these different barns and all I would hear are the BHS instructors yelling out, more leg, more leg, more leg. And it's like, what does that mean?
What does that
Right?
mean?
What does that mean? And
My legs are only so long. What do you mean, more leg?
what do you mean more leg? More upper leg, more lower leg,
Yeah,
more leg.
that's a good point.
And so we don't really get into some of the details of the thousands of different potential ways we could actually use our legs as riders. So that's today's topic, leg contact and leg aids, now that we finally got around to that. So, so off the horse, when you're working with people who are just coming into an Alexander technique lesson, can you talk about any patterns or maybe something common that you see with how people use their legs?
Mm.
Is there anything you find you have to sort of
Um,
address?
yeah, there's a lot of, and we've talked about this before, losing the ability to get your center of mass over the top of your feet. So that your center of mass is like right below your belly button. And most people put their center of mass behind their feet.
So the
So
weight goes to their
kind of a,
heels.
right, right. So just giving them that awareness of, could you check in with that? Where are you standing on your feet? And a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, is when a rider gets on a horse, sometimes they lose their relationship with gravity. There'll be more air, if you want to put it that way, instead of keeping that groundedness with the ground. And I
Yes.
see that in a lot of people, even people that aren't riders, that lack of connect between um, where you're standing over your feet.
Yeah, like you have that horse stand that's like a wooden stand with sort of a half barrel seat that you put people on. And as soon as our feet are literally off the ground, we do lose our sense of our connection to gravity. And gravity's
Yes,
still there, like it doesn't go away. But it's like without our
good point.
feet sort of on the ground, it's very common to lose that connection to the ever-present stillness or of gravity, where that's sort of where we get our feedback a lot when we walk, is where the weight is on our feet.
Yes. Or even I tell people, I kind of like search for the feeling of when you put on a new pair of shoes. Because we get ground in our habits of our own way of walking. And if you put on a new pair of shoes, or say it's springtime now and you choose to go walk outside in the grass, that brings up totally different sensations
Mm.
that travel through your entire body of your relationship with the ground.
So what you're saying is how we use our legs is directly related to how we align our center of mass over our feet, or how we align
Yes,
our
because
torso
the
over our
central
feet.
nervous system wants that balance of the center of gravity over the feet. Um, and there's multiple ways of doing that incorrectly, obviously, because we walk around like that all the time.
Oh
So
yeah,
finding that same thing.
I used to wear out the heels on my shoes. I would wear them
Ah,
lower on the outside of the
right?
heel. And I didn't realize that, again, like we talked about in the last podcast, these unconscious habits. But I would pick up every
Hmm.
set of riding boots I had, and the heels would be worn unevenly. They'd be higher towards the inside of the heel and lower to the outside
Hmm.
of the heel. And after doing some of the Alexander technique work, that really changed. I don't wear my heels the same way, but I don't
Right,
feel like I walk any differently because that's what unconscious habits are. But I noticed my heels don't wear down on the outside.
right. And those habits that we do on the ground, we take to the horse with our legs.
Yeah, or as a trained rider, you and I grew up hunter. And the fashion
Hmm.
was arch your back, shoulders back,
Yeah.
and you kind of learn to between heels down, shoulders back. As female riders, of course, we're going to overarch our lumbar, and then that's going to cause us to grip inward with the thigh and the knee. And I had a lot
Yes.
of knee pain and low back pain even as a teenager. I could kind of feel the pain in my knees and my low back, but I thought, oh, that's just part of
Part of
why
writing.
part of
Yeah.
riding, so you get used to it. So the first bit of self-awareness I had was that tendency to keep my low back really arched forward made me not only walk on the outside of my heels, but also walking off the horse. Like when I work with riders on the ground, some of our self-awareness of our habits can be, do I always have more weight towards the ball of my foot and the toes, or do I have more weight to the heel?
Hmm.
Right. And so that arch in my low back that was sort of habitual, I also walked very much on the balls of my feet.
Wow.
Right. And then when I did Alexander technique work, I remember like what that did to my legs was an unconscious habit of an upward pull in my
Good
leg
point.
muscles.
Yeah.
Right. So I always considered my personal conformation was sort of a long torso and short legs.
Wow.
And that's what I looked like in pictures. And that's what I looked like on horses. I looked like I had a long torso and short little jockey legs. And after the Alexander technique work, and then kind of learning my how to correct that habit, it wasn't anything but a habit in my lumbar and getting more over my legs, like you're describing, I could feel the arches of my feet when I walked, like little tiny trampolines. I started to become aware of the arches of my feet working. And then later, like, I don't know, much later down the road, I looked at some pictures somebody took of me riding, and I was like, when did I grow legs?
Yeah.
Like that whole perception, like what looked like bone structure, that my conformation was just long torso and short legs, totally changed.
Yeah.
Like that blew my mind. I no longer looked, I suddenly grew rider's legs. Like
Yeah.
I don't know when, I'm like, when did my legs get that long? And even taking my stirrups down several holes, like feeling less comfortable with my legs short. And that just blew my mind. Like that's
Hmm.
one of those experiences that really made me understand what the horses are going through when we change their balance as well.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that unraveling of the layers of the legs, because if we don't have the center of mass over our feet, we're going to grip with our legs. There's no other way when we're riding
Yeah.
that
So,
our bodies are going to stay on.
no, and that posture, which I don't know if I developed it as a hunter rider and carried it to
Mm,
the ground, or if it was my natural ground posture and that's why I gravitated to jumping. I don't know, but chicken and egg. But when I changed it, I also realized that habitual way of using myself was why my hamstrings were so freaking
screaming.
tight. Like I had these massive hamstrings, and I used to do yoga like 5 days a week, going, I
Oh
need to
my.
become more supple, and sort of like I could never get my legs to really unwind. And I go, well, of course I couldn't, because outside a yoga class, I'm walking around on the balls of my feet, I'm tightening my hamstrings, I'm
Yep.
arching my low back. So I'm just tightening those muscles constantly and then trying to counterbalance it with yoga stretching. And it was like the other thing that surprised me, not only did I grow longer legs after AT lessons, but all of a sudden I was limber. Like all of a
Interesting.
sudden I could do the forward bend and touch my toes. I could do these different yoga postures that I used to struggle with horribly with tight hamstrings. And I kept thinking I need to stretch the muscles, but what I really needed to do was change my habitual way of moving.
Yes.
And that again blew my mind. I was like, it was such a strong experience that I go, oh, so my entire leg use and how I wear my shoes off had everything to do with how I was coordinating my spine.
Yeah.
And once I changed consciously, which took quite a bit of work, but
Yes.
really consciously changed my habits of how I was coordinating my head and spine and pelvis, it was like my arms looked longer, my legs definitely looked longer, and my boots started wearing differently. And I had to take stirrups down in
Yep.
the saddle. And I was like, it was a whole new world.
And that's just the central nervous system finally saying, "Oh, this feels so much better."
Yeah. Yeah.
And the horses do that too. You know, when we get them closer and closer to better use of their bodies, that's when all of those personality problems start to go away.
And not only that, but by changing my balance and coordination, as a younger rider, it was a good thing I loved going fast because I was one of those people that you call having an electric butt. Like any horse I sat on, I just sort of escalated them. Like I could
Ah,
excite almost any horse I sat on, and I couldn't figure it out, right? And as my body use changed, that also quit happening.
that makes
Like,
so much sense because we don't realize if we don't have our torso in a balanced position, something at a very low or high level is going to grab. It's going
yeah,
to it's going to tighten. Um, and people think it's just their legs. Oh, well, sort of yes and sort of no.
the legs are overworking. And
Yeah.
when I work with riders, I actually sort of call the three different postures the leg riders, the seat riders, and the rein riders. Because
Wow.
sort of in those three categories, and that's all every rider has is rein, seat, and leg. At the end of the day, that's all we've got.
Right.
But depending on our habits of use, a leg rider is what I was, which I was not stable with my torso or center of mass over my feet. So my legs were super strong. I wanted my stirrups short and
Yep.
my thighs were like steel. That's what I was balancing on was heels down and thighs in. And that's
And
really
yeah,
typical. I think you did the same thing.
yeah, I can totally relate to that. And what I finally figured out why I was doing that is I was connecting my pelvis in thinking to my legs. I was thinking that my torso stopped, like at my belly button, and everything below that was my legs.
Ah,
So once
yes,
I changed my thinking of no, 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 your spine goes all the way down to your tailbone.
to your seat
That
bones.
pelvis is connected to your torso, and the arms and legs are just supposed to hang off of the torso. That's when my stirrups started to lengthen and I didn't grip anymore. It was more of the torso balancing so the legs could be used for contact or aids
Yeah.
instead of gripping to stay on.
Yeah. And I think I don't know that we're aware of that, but I do find it's common that we tend to think our legs start where our pants start.
Right.
So if we're in high-waisted breeches, it's like it does make your legs look longer, but your legs still start where they start. And if you're in the low-rise breeches, it's like, nope, your legs are still under that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so having like the rain riders sort of have their center of their point of balance or center of mass a little high. So you're sort of
Right.
balancing through the shoulders and arms, and you really need the reins for stability. And the seat riders are typically back on their pockets and sort of just balancing with most of the weight in the seat. And then the leg riders, which is most jump riders like us, are sort of very light in the upper body and the seat, but really strong, sort of gripping with the legs.
Hmm.
Yeah. And love those short stirrups.
And sometimes you do need short stirrups if, I don't know, if you're jumping 3 or 4 feet or higher
Yeah, or racing, of course you do.
or something like that. But really,
For
in
doing your
everyday
flat
riding,
work.
it's not
Yeah,
necessary.
yeah. No.
And it's
So
interesting, we don't make the comparison between how we're using our legs and how the horse is using their legs.
absolutely. Or
Yeah,
what
we don't make, we're always trying to fix the horse's legs and their leg kinematics, but are we really looking at how we're using ours?
and not just legs, like you're saying, the leg use is really the result of getting our center of mass over our feet.
Hmm.
And so if we're ahead or behind our feet with our center of mass, what we're doing is actually generating with our weight and mass and our leg use, we're generating a force either sort of driving downward into the horse's back or backwards against the horse's back. And so our weight and mass is sort of creating pinpoints of pressure,
Yes.
right? So pressure, like when we're well balanced as a rider, part of it is we're equalizing our body weight between our upper body, upper torso, arms, mid torso to pelvis, and then legs, upper legs to lower legs. And when we distribute our own body weight vertically more equally, we feel lighter to the horse,
Yeah.
right?
And
So,
you can even go back to what you were saying about your boots. So I'm just getting this visual, or maybe it's a sound of you walking, and all I can hear is heels striking. And this
clunk,
bam,
clunk.
bam, bam.
Yes.
It's that.
Yes. No, and then pretty soon after that, somebody comes to you and says, I think I'm struggling with what is it? Uh what's that heel pain? That's the tendon related one.
The fascial pain.
Yeah,
Oh gosh, what is that called? Oh,
I
it'll
can't
come to me.
remember the name of it. It'll come to
And
you. I want to
yes,
say tensor fasciata, but it's not that.
no, it's
It
not
was
that.
it's I
It's the
can't think of it.
plantar fascia on the
That's
feet.
it. Plantar
Hmm.
fasciitis. Yeah, plantar fasciitis is pretty painful.
Yeah, I've had it. I
Yeah,
had it for 8 months. Yeah,
and walking on the heels doesn't help that.
it doesn't help.
Yeah. So when we're either kind of stabilizing with most of our energy in our upper body, balancing on the reins, what we're doing is concentrating our body weight through the reins into a small surface area in the horse's mouth.
Wow.
When we're seat riders and we're sort of back on our pockets, we're actually concentrating our body weight into the seat and the saddle. So we feel heavier because there's more pounds per square inch, either in the
Wow.
hands or the seat or the legs. And if we go way back when we reviewed that research paper, the Umwelt paper,
Hmm.
it's like around the horse's barrel where the rider's legs go was measured the highest level of skin sensitivity. And I just think I must have felt like a vice grip. That's why I
Me
didn't
too.
really have an electric butt. I just felt like a vice grip every time I would get on a horse. And they're like, whooshoo, I guess we have to go fast.
I guess I better go.
Yeah, I guess I better go. This one's hanging on tight.
No
Yeah,
wonder I got bucked off so much.
I know, right? Yes. So so the first use of the legs when we're riding, I would say to develop what would be a good leg contact means we have to get our center of mass over the arches of our feet, no matter what stirrup length we're riding with,
Exactly.
right? And a lot of people who ride with short stirrups, when they're not jumping or galloping, what I see is they're sitting in the seat and the legs are stuck out in front of them.
Hmm.
right? So if we're behind, if we're sort of heel walking, or if we're
Mhm.
behind true vertical with our center of mass over our feet, what happens with the legs is the upper thigh sort of opens away from the saddle, and the legs push forward ahead of the torso, and you actually have very little calf contact, if any,
Right. There's hardly
right?
any contact of the leg really at that point.
Yeah. And so people in that posture will tend to really grip with the lower thigh just above the knee.
Hmm.
And so most of the leg contact will be just above the knee, or just below the knee on the upper calf. And that's it. So you're not really getting any information about the movement of the horse because your legs are out in front of you. And in that riding position where our center of mass is behind our legs or behind our feet, I also see a lot of lateral instability because the upper thigh is opened away from the saddle. So there's
Hmm.
no support of the thigh bone to the torso.
Yes.
And then the way you and I rode with the center of mass too far forward,
Hmm.
what that does is literally push the legs backwards.
Yes.
Right? So in order not to land on your crotch, you better be closing those legs in hard against the saddle. So you end up having, and again, your upper thigh might be in more contact, but your whole thigh is sort of squeezing in.
Right.
And
It's
it,
contracting. I mean, it's gripping.
yeah. So you, again, you can't feel the horse because
Mhm.
you're having to use so much muscular effort just to stabilize.
Right.
Yeah. And then we also tend to jam our heels down as a counterbalance to our leg gravitating backwards. And and then that's going to pop the lower leg contact off the horse as well.
Mhm.
So again, we're only going to have contact just under the knee with the very upper part of the thigh. And I'll actually walk riders through that and go, if you on purpose sort of lean back, whether they collapse and round the spine or not, as soon as you take your center of mass backwards behind true vertical alignment with gravity, the legs will automatically, the upper thigh will open and the legs will be in front of the torso.
Mhm.
That's just where the legs go as a result of where the center of mass is. And then as you
Yes.
come forward, if you go too far forward, again, you're either going to land on your crotch and you're going to know you're too far forward, or at a certain point, as soon as we get one hair too far forward, we feel our legs wanting to go backwards. So we instinctually start to grip inward
Yep.
with the thighs and start to push the heel down. And that's really, if we're up on a horse, what our legs are doing dynamically actually helps us as riders know where our center of mass is truly vertical over gravity.
Yes.
And that's something I use all the time because I'm on different horses in different saddles, and that can really throw off your sense of where you are over gravity because each saddle kind of affects the rider in a little different way, and each horse's movement affects the feeling of your riding position as well. So one of the ways I know my center of mass is over the arches of my feet and I'm aligned with gravity is when I find that my upper inner thigh gently, automatically, like I'm not trying to do it. It's just the result of getting my center of mass in the right place. The upper inner thigh sort of snugs in against the saddle.
Yeah.
And the lower thigh, just above the knee, gently comes away from the saddle.
Hmm. Yeah. It gets more of a wrapping around effect is what I like to call it.
Yeah.
It just spirals all the way down to your feet.
I was going to say, even my calf contact
Yeah.
goes from a little bit on the upper calf almost all the way down to my ankle.
Hmm.
Like suddenly I have that entire calf muscle. I can feel the
It's
barrel of the
available.
horse.
It's right there.
Yeah. So
There's
then the,
no big movements that need to happen at that point to give an aid.
Exactly. It's just a contraction of the muscle becomes the leg aid. I don't have to like wing my legs out and close them in or make a gesture inward with the leg.
And I know a lot, I work a lot with people about their relationship with their foot in the stirrup.
Oh yeah, that's a biggie too.
It's a big trigger, especially if you've been riding for a while, and always checking in, are you bracing against that stirrup? Or I'll ask people to just check in with the backs of their knees. Is
Yeah.
it soft? Is it available to you? Or because if you're locking and bracing your foot, you're doing the same thing at your knee and probably at your hip.
Yeah, and when you think of like one of the best uses of the legs, whether we're riding with a long stirrup or short stirrup, is if the hip joint, knee joint, and ankle joint are all sort of equal in their flexion or
Mhm.
extension in the angle between each joint, then they act like shock absorbers.
Yes.
And they start to absorb a lot of the vertical force of the horse's movement in trot and canter especially, so that our torso and our center of mass doesn't get catapulted all over the place. So
Or the
you
ponytail bob.
or yeah, or the head bob. Yeah. Yeah, so if we lock when we do heels down, and I think we've talked about this on the Heels Down podcast, we excessively flex the ankle joint, which is going to take flexion out of the knee joint and typically lock the hip joint.
Hmm.
So all of a sudden, our shock absorbers are shot.
Right. And then it comes out through the torso somewhere.
Yes, a very unstable core or
Hmm.
unstable center of mass. Yeah.
Yes.
So on any stirrup length, I like the words you use, each joint being open and available, that we can sort of feel there's some mobility available in the joint, and then they can act truly like shock absorbers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've talked about that before. If there's any level of tension or contraction in the legs, then those joints aren't going to be open and available.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that goes back to where the center of mass is. So it's all related.
No, and a lot of times I will have riders explore, and a lot of riders voluntarily just drop their stirrups while they're working
That's
on
the best
balance.
teacher. Yeah, that's the best teacher.
But and I know you did this too, a lot of jump riders to strengthen the leg, you ride without stirrups. But they tell you, or you do, heels down, and you're
Hmm.
still gripping with the
And you
legs.
still
So,
grip,
so you really lose the value of riding without stirrups because you're trying to mimic a leg use that you have with the stirrup. And I
right?
go, okay, missing the point, missing the point, missing the point. So when we ride without stirrups, like the advantage, and I've actually had people go into a little bit of pain if
Mm,
they've been tight in their legs. When we drop the stirrups, we're letting gravity do the muscle stretching for us
right,
and open all three of those leg joints. And at the same time, feeling that separation, like you said, the legs start where the pants fold when we sit, very near the seat bones. So when we
yes,
take our legs, our feet out of the stirrups, we can start to feel, oh, we're balancing on the seat bones and upward. That's where the torso balance lives. And the legs literally get the sensation of hanging like they're supposed to.
right. And it can bring up a lot, like we talked in the last podcast, that can bring up a lot of emotional disturbance
Oh, yeah.
when you,
Especially if you're a leg rider.
yeah, yeah, and you may have to do it at a halt.
Yeah, because all of a sudden your whole nervous system is like recalculating,
Yeah, wait a
recalculating.
minute.
Yeah, you suddenly realize how unstable your torso has been,
Right. On how you've been focusing on gripping with your legs
or bracing in the
or
stirrups.
bracing with your legs to maintain balance.
Yeah, and again, one of those unconscious thoughts. I think it's a little bit instinctive to every rider that because, like we talked about, I think in the last podcast, when we get on a horse, our feet are no longer touching the ground. And
Hmm.
it's very easy to lose our sense of connection to gravity.
Right.
And so a lot of people push down into the stirrups, sort of trying to find that foot connection that's
That
so
must be the
natural
heels
for us.
down thing.
Well, heels down is really to prevent the foot slipping into the stirrup
Mm,
because brand new riders, no matter how athletic you are, you put a human on a horse and we gravitate into the fetal position. So if our toes are pointed down through the stirrup, we can really get hung up in the stirrup, and that's
right.
very dangerous. If we fell off and our foot was still in the stirrup, that's pretty bad. So heels down is really a safety thing for new humans on horses. But I don't think it sort of almost perpetuates the idea that the stirrups are there to be pushed into.
Mm, good point.
And they're really not. What I have to often explain to people is I'll have them ride without stirrups. And when you let your leg hang, toes down is safe without stirrups. So you let the toes hang down, right? So if you're just completely relaxing the leg and balancing the torso, the toe should be the lowest point of the leg, right? And without stirrups, that's perfectly safe, you guys. You do not have to do heels down without stirrups. There's no point. So letting people ride around like that, sometimes in 5 or 10 minutes, people's legs become painful from the stretching or
Yeah.
release of
The
tension,
unraveling of everything. Yeah.
right? But if people can handle it, I'll let them go 15, 20 minutes without stirrups. And then before putting the leg, there's a couple ways. If we're riding by ourselves, we can put one foot in a stirrup and keep the other leg hanging. And that's how we can become aware of our habitual leg use,
Yeah,
right?
I've used another exercise too. With your foot in the stirrup, can you bend your knee and bring your heel up towards your butt without falling to one side or the other?
Oh, yeah, that would really put you on the inner thigh as well
Yeah.
to
So,
have to
you know,
balance that.
how coordinated with your balance are you when you actually start flexing joints?
Yeah, yeah. So taking the foot in and out of the stirrup by bringing
Hmm.
your heel closer to you, closer to the saddle,
Yes.
and really playing with the knee joint while you're
Yes.
balancing your torso. Ooh, that's a
Because
good
we
one.
tend to function just from the hip joint to put our foot in the stirrup instead of thinking, oh, well, I could actually bend my hip, bend my knee, and bend my ankle to get my foot in the stirrup.
Oh, yeah. No, and what you're describing is that sort of lean to the right to get
Yeah.
your left foot in the stirrup, and that lean to the left to get your right foot in the stirrup. Yeah. And again, coming back to sort of how we think about the stirrups, we think unconsciously, most of us, that the stirrups are there for us to push down into. And one of the things I'll do after the rider's leg has been hanging is I go, okay, I'm going to simulate the stirrup. So I sort of weave my fingers together and I make a little platform with my hands. And when we're riding without stirrups, we have almost no calf contact. That's
Mhm.
where it should be, right? So when I start to push upward on the ball of the rider's foot, I can feel them tighten and lift the leg. And I go, no, 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 leave it hanging, leave it hanging. And this is a little physics perspective. The stirrup actually is meant to push up on the leg. We don't
Mm,
push down on the stirrup, right? So what the stirrup does, and that's what I simulate with my hands, is I go, the stirrup allows your hip, knee, and ankle to bend. And with the stirrup, we have almost the full length of our calves in contact with the skin of the horse,
mhm.
right? So that to me is the point of the stirrup.
Right.
So the stirrup catches our hanging downward leg and supports it back up to put a light bend through the hip, knee, and ankle joint and give us a calf contact without us having to pull our legs upward.
Right.
Right. So when our leg is hanging and draping down and we're allowing the stirrup to push up and put a bend in the leg, we're not using excess muscle tension, so we feel the horse more clearly.
Yes.
And we're not contracting around the joints, so all three leg joints can now work as shock absorbers
Hmm.
to the vertical force of the motion.
Yeah, like you said earlier, I say that to myself all the time when I'm riding. Are all my joints open and available? Am I locking anywhere? It's a constant question I ask when I ride.
Yeah, or even having a different relationship, so to speak, with the stirrups. Am
Hmm.
I pushing down
Yeah,
or am I hanging down,
yeah,
allowing the stirrup to push back up against my leg?
yeah.
Right. And that's that. I think when we were way back talking about forces of motion, it's that ground force reaction,
Yes.
like how we push against the ground and gravity actually pushes up against us as our
Hmm.
weight pushes us down. And
It's the
it's
ground
it's
reaction force.
yeah,
Yep.
that's where I go. It's a little mind bending and I don't do the math very well. So anything you want to add to the leg use of the rider?
No, it's just what we've been talking about. The center of mass over your feet is really important. I think we've used this term before. It should be like you're standing over the horse and not sitting on the horse. I think that term
Yes.
condones sitting on your pockets.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think when we get in the saddle and it's described as sitting the horse,
Hmm.
so we kind of gravitate to an armchair position.
Right.
But
And
if we go ahead.
I know we've said this in previous podcasts, but that posture of the chair sitting that you just described, um, in the last podcast, we it's that choice of self-awareness of, am I doing that? Should
Yeah.
I question? Where are my pockets?
Yeah,
And
or
what
where
really
are my
helps, and
seat
we mentioned
bones?
this in another podcast, is taking pictures,
Oh yeah.
because our software needs to be updated, and if we don't actually see it, because I when I position people to that neutral standing over the horse, and I'm sure you've heard it, is you always hear, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm falling forward."
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so
that's where
I
we
take a
get,
picture and they're like, "Oh, I can't possibly be there. That
yeah.
doesn't."
No, that goes back to that process of change podcast. It's like
Yeah,
first is resistance. This feels wrong.
wrong,
Then you
wrong.
you show them the picture, which I do too, and there's a sense of disorientation. This
What?
can't be right. Yeah. Yeah.
But to be curious enough to ask the questions when you get on, am I bracing? Where are my feet in the stirrups? What's my relationship with my stirrup that I have with my foot?
To my center of mass,
Yeah.
right? Like that
How
relationship. It's
geeky is that?
yeah. And as soon as I'll ask somebody just to find without their stirrups, it's actually easier. I go, can you find a standing position?
That's a
And
good way
as
to put it.
and as soon as, especially without stirrups, people tend to sit up into a sense of standing or move the torso
They do.
forward into a sense of standing, and automatically the legs come right under the center of mass,
Yeah. And it's
especially
just
if
a
we talk
biomechanical advantage
about
that the body goes to. It makes sense to the body at that point.
yeah. And at first, like again, in this process of change, a lot of riders who have been either bracing on the reins or relying on sort of their seat, sitting backwards, or gripping with the legs, they'll get more unstable at
Yes.
first
Yes.
and suddenly go, whoa, like this doesn't feel good or right. This feels awful. because all of a sudden that sort of stabilizing mechanism that they were using dysfunctionally, but still stabilizing, is taken away.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other thing I'll say a lot is find the ground. Your balance is relative to the arena, not the horse.
Exactly.
Right.
And most people think their horse is balanced, which that's probably a whole nother podcast.
That's a course.
That's a
Like that's a
course.
course. Yeah. I'm working on it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. You are working on it.
Yeah.
But that is not true. I don't think I've ever ridden a balanced horse.
Well, here's the ironic part. And actually, I started doing a monthly newsletter. And side note, if you guys want to sign up, it's on my website in the description box below. But in the newsletter this month, I really talked about sort of how we're like our balance is always relative to gravity.
Always.
Always. And what we're dealing with forces of motion are the forces of motion are acting against the stability of our center of mass.
Hmm.
Right? So it's our job, our instinct is to brace against that force, try to control the force, either
Hmm.
brace against it, try to control it, or get scared because we're succumbing to it,
Right.
right? We're really like any athlete, getting our center of mass back in line with gravity is a constant, ever-changing adjustment because we're always dealing with new forces of motion every stride.
Yes.
Right? And a friend of mine showed me this picture. It was great. It was out of a racing magazine. And this racehorse is rearing straight up, right? And almost vertical in the rear, like pretty darn close to it. And there's a jockey on board, right? And the jockey just adapted to the
Right.
rear. And if you really looked at it, it looked like the jockey was riding the lower neck. He was so far
Far
forward on
up.
the horse.
Yeah.
But if you looked at his center, the center of mass in the middle of his torso, it was plumb line vertical to gravity,
Yeah.
adapting to that humongous rear by getting his center of mass over his feet with this incredible vertical force called a racehorse rearing,
Yeah.
which may as well be a big fat wave coming in at the beach. It's a
Yeah.
lot of force, right? So we learn to get up over that force or sort of ride the waves of force, but always keeping our center of mass over our feet in line with gravity is really the essence of balance.
And I think it's important to realize it's not a place. You don't get there and stay there. It's a constantly moving, you know,
Yeah,
thing, like you've spoken like a river. It's the forces are constantly, we have
changing.
to constantly negotiate that balance. It's not, and we've
It's
heard
not a
this,
position.
right? It's not a position, it's not a place, it's just constantly moving.
Yes, and adapting.
Yeah.
No, and the other thing I wanted to say about that was we all have these horses that are not well balanced. That's what we're all riding because across the horse industry, our understanding of horse balance is really pretty low if we look at it from a authentic mechanical sort of use of the
Right.
body. And so the good news is we're all riding kind of rough conditions.
Yep.
Right. And even though we think, oh, poor me, I have to ride this horse that doesn't move very well, the good news is those sort of energetic flows of the forces of motion are freaking obvious.
Yeah.
I go, okay, it may be the rapids like a mountain river, but at least it's obvious,
Yeah.
right? And what I find is you can't ride a perfectly balanced horse for very long if you're not well balanced, because it's
That
a
is so true.
relationship of weight and mass. So if you take a really unstable, unbalanced rider and put them on a horse that was really well trained in balance, had extremely good self carriage, was well muscled, I give it 6 months to a year before that horse loses
Is messed
balance
up.
and falls apart
Yep.
because the horse will always default. to the physical impact of the rider's weight and mass on their movement, on their body. So I go, there's no sort of avoiding that. So I no longer feel bad about not having a schoolmaster. I go, your schoolmaster is your horse.
Right. It's your best teacher.
Find your balance on that,
Yes.
right?
The
And
constantly changing place.
and yeah, hard to ride forces of motion.
Yep.
Because once you can find your balance on that, you become a better guide.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we digressed off of the whole leg thing, but it's definitely related to how we use our legs.
Yes.
So, quick recap is just, I think what you said in the beginning is really the most important. When we find that standing sensation over the horse, and it does help to drop the stirrups, we have to find that relationship of our center of mass over our feet
Mhm.
and over gravity.
Yes. That's
And
the key.
the use of our legs, we don't try, like I spent years as a rider, especially going from jumping to dressage, where I would sort of pull my legs around into the right place that my instructor wanted to see. And then I'm like, oh, duh, all I have to do is adjust my torso and my legs fall into the right place. That was a big aha moment for me.
Hmm.
So instead of forcing our legs into this picture perfect position or use, we just sort of rock our torso forward and back
Hmm.
until we feel our legs change. And
Yes.
that's where our center of mass is truly over the middle of our feet
Yep.
and in line with gravity.
Yep.
I think that's a boatload of information. I think
Yeah,
we
it
could
is.
stop there. Anything you want to add?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you're enjoying these Horse Geeks podcasts and looking at horses and riding from the inside out. Please like, share, subscribe, and yada, yada, yada. And we will see you next time.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. Bye.